All right, we're making progress here. We figured out how to work the mic. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I am Woody Martin with Sierra Club here in Lafayette, Louisiana, and Acadian Group. We have some other members of our group here who've been very interested in this issue. I think this is probably the fourth public meeting that we have had on issues surrounding the I-49 development in the corridor. And this is a bit of a special meeting because we have some information for you tonight that you have probably not heard previously. And so that being related to chemical contamination in the corridor. The agenda says that we will proceed with Union Pacific Railroad toxic contamination and implications for the Chico Aquifer and Lafayette Utility System water supply. Bill Goodell of Goodell Law Firm will make that presentation, sitting behind me. We'll have Kim Goodell with Watermark Alliance discussing water and the public trust. Then we will have Michael Walden, Dr. Michael Walden, PhD extraordinaire, on DOTD, that's Department of Transportation Development, Phase 1 findings concerning contaminants in the rail yard. And then we'll have a few minutes of historical perspective with Mr. Harold Shuffler, whom I'm sure you're all familiar with. So, and then of course, we'll have a public comments and questions. So if you can, please hold your questions to the end of the period. If you just can't bear it and you're sure that you're going to forget, you know, it's okay to raise your hand. This is a public meeting, and we're very we're okay with that. But we'd like to leave most of the public discussion towards the end of the four presentations that we have tonight. But you won't be thrown out if you raise your hand and ask a question, okay? I am going to be kind of the timekeeper moderator. I'm going to try to keep people on the subject of discussion tonight. So please put up with my encouragement that you stay on topic, and I appreciate if you can do that. So, are there any announcements, anything right now from the group, from people in the group that we need? We'll have an announcement period towards the end also, because when we have these discussions, you think of things, and then you want to tell people, and that's okay, public meeting. So again, thank you so much for coming. We will start off with Bill Goodell talking about the rail yard contamination and implications for our water. Bill, you're on.
Good evening. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I'm Bill. Nice to meet you. See many familiar faces and some new ones. I'm an environmental lawyer. I've been practicing environmental law for about 30 years, and I teach it at Tulane. Been doing that for about 20 years.
Sit there so I can see.
I'm going to share with you the results of some of my investigations regarding the Union Pacific Rail Yard in downtown Lafayette, and the Lafayette drinking water and the Chico Aquifer. And all of the factual information that you will hear tonight is available in the public record on the DEQ website for the most part. I mean, there might be a couple of things that came from a Lafayette public records request, but not much. So anyway, without further ado, let me just walk you through this thing. The Chico Aquifer, if you don't know, is a very, very large aquifer, supplies drinking water for most of southwest Louisiana. Here's a map that shows the general range of it, or scope of its coverage, if you will. And now this is an interesting little, sorry about that, I'm still learning how to mess with this. Once I get it, I'll be, okay. All right. This shows the relative depth of the Chico from the surface. And if you'll see, there's Lafayette Parish right there. The red means 40 to 80 feet, and the blue means less than 40 feet. The nearer the aquifer is to the surface, the more at risk it is from surface impacts due to contaminants, okay? Lafayette, as you see, is one of the shallower areas of the Chico, 40 feet. That's pretty close. It doesn't have, contaminants don't have to migrate a long way to get to 40 feet below the surface. In the course of my investigations, I've determined that from the Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals database, this p-dichlorobenzene, which we're just going to call it DCB for the purposes of this presentation, has been detected in the groundwater from the LUS water supply wells since 2008. Okay? The levels in 2012, and I'll show you in a second on a little chart that I've prepared, show that 3 of the supply wells closest to where the rail yard is got hits, as we say in the lingo of my business. And those hits, some of them showed up again in 2015. Okay, this is the chart. I hope you can read it. But this is 2008. You get a hit of this DCB in this water well 22, which is actually northeast of the northernmost part of the rail yard. But then a couple of years later in 2012, you get all of these hits showing up. Actually, there was one in 2010 over here in this well. And then you get a couple more hits 3 years later. All right? So that means that this contaminant is getting sucked into the Lafayette drinking water supply system. Here's a map to orient you. Outlined in red is the rail yard facility, and these are the wells that are getting the hits of the contaminant, okay? And these wells to the northeast are some of the other ones that are getting hits that are farther away. Now, this DCB has also been detected in the soils about right here within the rail yard, okay? So it's not just that we're getting a contaminant, we've got a source with the same contaminant. And our contention is, through experts and just understanding how things work in a hydrogeological setting, the contamination in the rail yard is being sucked in to these water wells. In law, I'm not going to talk a lot of law tonight, but in law, there is a legal presumption that contamination from outside or found outside of a facility is sourced from the facility. Here's the Louisiana Environmental Quality Act, and I've highlighted in red where this is provided. And this is a 1984 policy statement by the Louisiana legislature. Way back in the day when the environment was not much of a concern, it was just starting to become a concern, our state legislature recognized how important it was to protect our groundwater. And they developed this evidentiary presumption. that if you've got pollution in groundwater, which is waters of the state, okay, adjacent to or on a site, it's evidence that the site is the source. That can be rebutted, but it's presumed to be. So for purposes of law, this contaminant comes from the railroad. It's up to the railroad to show they're not the source. That's not me, that's the law. That's Louisiana's legal presumption, all right? Now, some other things that Louisiana has in its Environmental Quality Act that have bearing on these kinds of situations, for lack of a better word. You know, it's been long recognized in Louisiana that hazardous chemicals have been disposed of, and look, I'll read the statute. Hazardous chemicals and substances have been disposed of in Louisiana for many years in a manner that, although possibly legal at the time, was careless and inappropriate and created conditions which are extremely dangerous and may cause long-term health and environmental problems for the people of this state. Those persons generating these substances knew or were in a position to know of the hazardous and dangerous nature of the substances. And they knew or should have known that improper disposal, which is what has gone on at the rail yard for a century, could cause irreversible environmental damage as well as long-term health risks. This is the kicker if you want to talk about policy in my mind tonight. The state cannot and should not bear the costs associated with a private profit-making venture. In other words, railroad, you did it, railroad, you clean it up. It's pretty basic. We, the taxpayers, should not foot the bill for the profit-making venture of the railroad. State law, state policy. You've heard a lot. I'm sure there's been some airplay in the newspapers about people saying, well, you don't have to worry about that contamination out there because it's protected. We've got all these clays that protect our aquifers. Well, in a word, it's baloney, okay? As a guy that's been doing this stuff for 30 years, I can tell you there are many studies showing just the opposite. But don't take my word for it. Take the state legislature's word for it. Because in 1984, they also made a finding when they were trying to get the state cleaned up, when people were really concerned and trying to get something done. It is the determination of the legislature that Louisiana is particularly ill-suited, hydrologically and climatically, to hazardous waste land disposal methods, and past land disposal methods, siting criteria, and maintenance procedures have, despite the degree of stringency, been inadequate to ensure the health of the citizens of the state and maintaining the integrity of the environment generally and water resources specifically. The legislature found, and this is backed up by science, in 1984, they found as a policy matter that we're not going to allow land disposal anymore. This is what they call the land ban statute, and it's been something that has been eliminated as allowed in Louisiana. But of course, you've got the past disposal practices that are still causing a problem, the rail yard being Exhibit A, if you will. Okay, now, let's talk about the chemical that we're dealing with. DCB is an EPA suspected carcinogen, all right? It's bad, okay? I mean, and in addition to this chemical, many other chemicals have been found in this rail yard. These chemicals were found in the rail yard, not by me, by consultants for the rail yard and other people who owned property where these rail yard operations had been conducted. They went out and did studies, and their studies found all these organic and inorganic compounds that are classified as hazardous substances and are basically dangerous to human health. They shouldn't be in the soil, they shouldn't be in the groundwater, they shouldn't be around people. This is a list, this table 1 of some of the chemicals found in the soil. And it's a that whole alphabet soup thing. You can't pronounce half of them, but it's just to show you. These are the kinds of things that have been found out there conclusively. These are some of the chemicals that have been found in the groundwater within the rail yard. Again, many are listed EPA Superfund hazardous substances. Okay? In addition to that, many of these compounds have never been tested for in the Lafayette Utility Service water well sampling protocols. A year ago, February 1st, I filed a lawsuit on behalf of some concerned citizens to get the DEQ, the EPA, the city, and the rail yard to the table to hammer out a plan to assess this contaminated area and get it cleaned up and protect our aquifer. This had to be done because there was a prior lawsuit which was settled and no cleanup was ever done as a result of that lawsuit. So I filed the lawsuit with the specific goal and intention of getting this cleaned up. It's time to do it. And after I filed the lawsuit, I start to get the information that is in the Lafayette water wells. There was a federal court that ruled on the prior lawsuit. And that Judge Maurice Hicks in Shreveport, issued a memorandum ruling, and he found that samples at the Chestnut Street site, which, remember I showed you where the soils, they had the DCB? All right, that's Chestnut Street. That's right next to the Salvation Army, if you're familiar with that part of Lafayette. Right across the railroad tracks from the Rosa Parks train station, all right? They found, the judge found that you had samples at 42 feet that exceeded the recap screening levels. Recap screening levels are cleanup standards that the DEQ has to apply. If you exceed a screening standard, that means there is an unacceptable risk posed by those levels. That's the DEQ law. That's not my law. That's what DEQ rules say. Again, they're risk-based to protect human health. Similar rules are applied by EPA as well. This is another thing that Judge Hicks found in the prior lawsuit before it was settled. He determined that there's a large area out there that's contaminated, but it's never been evaluated as one big problem. It's been a piecemeal, look at this, look at that. And as Judge Hicks found, piecemeal testing of a large problem doesn't make any sense. You clean up this little spot, but what about all the spots around it? You have to assess the entire area and clean it all up at one time to make sure you've eliminated the problem. Much of this rail yard area north of Johnston Street has never been investigated. That one little spot on Chestnut Street next to the Salvation Army is it. There's large areas beyond that nobody's ever looked at. This map shows you some of, there's Johnston Street right there. There's Salvation Army about right there. And there's all of the different facilities that were used in conjunction with prior rail yard activities over the last 100 years or so. Major potential sources of contamination. Nobody's ever popped a hole. Nobody's ever done anything to investigate these areas. They, I contend, are highly likely sources of contamination in the Chico Aquifer. I can't prove it because I haven't popped any holes yet, but it's very likely that they are, because the very same types of facilities that are investigated south of Johnston Street are the basis of all of the information that we've got so far, where DEQ looked at it and said, yeah, there's problems out there. Screening standards exceeded. Recap standards exceeded. significant contamination right at the top of the Chico. But nobody ever in those prior investigations tested the Chico. This is just another map showing the rail yard, giving you an idea of where things are to get oriented. There's Johnson Street again, Salvation Army over here. All of this was investigated before and found to be heavily contaminated. Nothing was cleaned up. Nothing. The Chico Aquifer is very special in law. It is designated as a sole source aquifer, and it is protected under a program within the Safe Drinking Water Act called the Wellhead Protection Program. You ever drive on Evangeline Thruway going north from Pinhook towards the interstate? Has anyone ever seen this sign before? I lived in Lafayette. I'm an environmental lawyer. I look for this kind of stuff. I kind of, I lived here for 25 years and I never saw this sign. Wellhead Protection Area. The area north of this sign, which is Evangeline Thruway, looking up towards the rail yard, is in this specially designated EPA area that requires protection because of the Chico Aquifer's significance and because of its very close proximity to the surface. There's the back of the sign. It shows it was installed in '95, right about when I got here. This is another one. All right, this is on Johnston Street, right past University, going towards the railroad tracks. Okay, another one, wellhead protection. So you've got a designated EPA Safe Drinking Water Act wellhead protection program that goes from University up Johnson to the rail yard and goes from Pinhook up Evangeline across the rail yard. It's smack dab in the middle of this highly contaminated area. Generally, and this is a little bit repetitive, but the top of the Chico has been established in the rail yard. I mean, we've got these regional maps, and they're good. They tell us what's happening on a regional basis, but anyone there are a lot of people in the oil business probably in this room know, you got to go down under the ground to find out what's really happening. Well, the borings in the rail yard have established that the Chico is about 50 feet deep, with some boring showing it coming in at 37. And in fact, this one boring, this EB1 that was done in front of the Salvation Army, the consultant that logged the well, he was drilling a boring to try and find out where the aquifer was, and he stopped short of it, but he noted the geological changes as he went down in a boring log. And he noted that you were starting to get into sand and silt at 28 feet below land surface. So generally speaking, you're at 40 to 50 feet at the rail yard, but you've got some places where you're getting to the top of the Chico at 28 feet. That's pretty doggone shallow. In conjunction with my lawsuit, don't take my word for all of this, take a former DEQ secretary, Paul Tomplett, secretary from 88 to 92. And in his report that he prepared that we filed with our lawsuit, he's noted that facility soil and groundwater conditions constitute an imminent and substantial endangerment to human health and the environment. The plumes must be fully delineated horizontally and vertically and mapped. That's what we want to do in our lawsuit. Let's find out where all the contamination is and let's map it so we can come up with a plan to clean it up and protect our aquifer. Or should I say, make the responsible party, Union Pacific, protect our aquifer. Some other points that Dr. Tomplin made in his report, that these DEQ recap soil and groundwater screening standards are exceeded. Some of the contaminants are listed, superabundant hazardous substances, including PAHs, benzene, xylene, arsenic, and lead. That the wastes are going to continue to spread until they are identified and cleaned up, and that they are threatening, if not already impacting the Chico. Again, at the time of this, we had no data in the Chico, so he couldn't say it definitely was, but now we've got it in the water wells. His opinion will change on that, I'm sure. Again, another opinion that the entire facility should be comprehensively assessed, just as Judge Hicks found in the prior lawsuit. Also, that there are abandoned water wells within the perimeter of the rail yard that can serve as a conduit for migration into the subsurface. And he just talks, the levels of some of the contaminants in this rail yard are frightening. You've got benzene, which he notes is Dr. Tompley again, a known human carcinogen, was found in the groundwater at 83 parts per billion. The recap standard is 5. Okay? Then he goes lead. Lead was found in the groundwater at 160 parts per billion. The screening standard under recap, the risk-based screening standard, is 15. Then you've got these chlorinated hydrocarbons, which are extremely dangerous. This DCB is a chlorinated hydrocarbon, or what they call a daughter compound of a chlorinated hydrocarbon. 17 times the screening standards. Acetone was found at 407,000 parts per billion. The screening standard is 100 parts per billion. These are serious numbers, people. We're not just talking about a little bit of something. These are serious numbers. MIBK, I don't even know what that stands for, I'm sorry. 527,000 parts per billion, 200 parts per billion is the acceptable screening standard level under the risk-based Louisiana cleanup rules. Okay? I'm now going to close with the doctrine of the public trust, and Kim's going to talk some more about it in a minute, but in 1974, our legislature, our governor, and our people approved the Constitution, which had an environmental protection provision in it. Pretty incredible that our state in 74 realized the significance of protecting the environment to the point where they felt they should put it in the Constitution and make a clean environment a constitutional right. And I'm going to read it, everyone can read it, but the natural resources of the state, including the air and water, and healthful, scenic, historic, and aesthetic quality of the environment, shall be protected, shall be conserved, and replenished insofar as possible and consistent with the health, safety, and welfare of the people. This law has been interpreted by our Supreme Court is saying that all state agencies must protect the public and our natural resources, that the rights of the public must receive active and affirmative protection by government bodies. Don't just sit back and wait for a permit to hit your desk and say yes or no. Be out there looking for problems. When problems are brought to your attention, be proactive and make something happen. That's your job. That's your constitutional duty. I submit to you that that duty has not been taken up by the federal government, by the state government, or by our local government. I will say this, I expect it from EPA, I expect it from DEQ. I don't know why our local government will not get involved and do something about this. It does not make sense.
Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight, and thank you, Sierra Club, for organizing this forum. I've been going to all of the meetings that have been held since the rollout in October of 2015 of the I-49 project, going there as Watermark Alliance representing water and the public trust. Simply that, not looking at design features, not getting involved in the discussions involving, whether it's elevated or not, or what's going to happen to the neighborhoods in the area of influence. Although I was very concerned about all those issues, I wanted to finish up with this project having a clear understanding of how water and public trust, the public trust doctrine that Bill talked about, was integrated into the various processes that were being carried out for this project. The process of deciding what kind of the actual feature, what kind of feature it would be, but also the processes involving context-sensitive solutions, where you look at the area and the people living close to this feature that they wanted to construct. I guess Watermark simply is that it's about water and the public trust doctrine. We trust the powers to be the local, state, and federal government and agencies to protect it. We trust them not just to react, but also to be proactive in protecting it. So Watermark is about maintaining appropriate interface with the government to help make community water supplies safe. It's about working with government on policies and ordinances. It's about leadership. It's not about lawsuits. We don't want lawsuits. This is about a community coming together and having the appropriate interface with their government. So Bill just ran through the situation that we're in Lafayette. We have a contamination site. It's been on our government records for more than 20 years. It's been documented for more than 20 years. We have our sole source drinking water situated just 38 feet below. And we have our public water wells either on or immediately adjacent to the hazardous site. We now have documentation in the records that show some of these contaminants are being drawn into those public water wells, and that it's been going on for quite a few years. And the most relevant of that is that with each test, with each measurement, the volumes are increasing. We have a DEQ sole source aquifer designation, which is offered the added protection that Bill mentioned under the Safe Drinking Water Act. It's a guide. It tells us this is to be valued. So we have a DEQ assessment and report that was mandated by the EPA in 2002. They mandated that all states assess the public drinking water wells and systems. Our DEQ did our initial assessment in 2002. The most important finding of that report was that our system has a high vulnerability to contamination rating, and all of our wells are rated highly vulnerable. Now, there's several different things that go into that. Mike, the guy that's going to follow me, the environmental engineer that's been working on this project as well, real involved in all of the meetings as well. He'll get into more of the details of that. But we also know that we have the factor of recharge for this area, while originally thought it was minimal, it's actually much higher than we thought.
Could you define recharge for an audience, please? The ability of an aquifer, the tendency of an aquifer to recharge from surface water draining through the soil.
Correct. Okay. Okay, so recharge area is the ability, the makeup of the soils and the ground to absorb and introduce and gather the surface water and drain into the aquifer. Is that good, Dennis?
That's good.
Okay.
Could you just identify who you are? You never told us. We knew it was the largest speaker at first, and then you just started talking. And I don't know who you come, who you with, or who is it?
We're just asking you to introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Wow. Okay. I'm Kim Goodell. I'm with Watermark Alliance.
Yeah, we introduced all the,
Microphone.
We went through the names of the presenters at the beginning of the meeting, but you're probably right. We didn't really introduce them. And so thank you for that input. You know Bill Goodell by now. And now we got Kim Goodell, Dr. Mike Walden right there, and Harold Shuffler right over there, and myself, Woody Martin. Is that okay? We good now?
Thank you. Okay, so I think I was talking about the 2002 EPA mandated assessment of our water system by DEQ and the findings of that assessment that was conducted. So they took these findings, DEQ did, and sat with our local government and LUS and came up with recommendations for the area inside the wellhead protection area. They also made a strong recommendation before our city council to adopt sole source aquifer ordinances to further protect just that area. Our city council unfortunately voted no on the matter. Now, at this time, it was 2006, 2007 when that was done. And I read the ordinances with the understanding of how extensive the contamination was in this area, in the wellhead protection area, and just the high vulnerability rating. And you really have to wonder what got in the way. These ordinances seemed very practical and very legitimate, and really something that could have gone a long way in protecting our drinking water supply. So now we have the Louisiana DOTD, LCG, and the Federal Highway and DEQ wanting us to just turn over this hazardous site to them so that they can do a spot cleaning and so that they can drive pilings through it into the Chico. I mean, an obvious threat when you know what they've already found there, much less if you do any more studies out there. But thank goodness for the local environmental stewards, like the Acadiana Sierra Club, Harold Scheffler, Woody Martin, Louisiana Chair, and all the others out there in the environmental sector that have been paying attention to this project. We have environmental engineers, we have public health folks that are looking at this. We have people that have dedicated their careers to studying environmental issues and making the connection to public health. It's unfortunate, though, that environmental sector has really been left out of the reevaluation process for the I-49 project. The community working group meeting, or community working group for the CSS process has over 50 people. They designated one environmentalist, Mr. Harold Scheffler, to sit on that committee. But I can attest to the fact that every time he tried to raise these environmental issues, he would be dismissed or he would be shut down. They would, sometimes it was actually rude. It was obvious they didn't want the contamination to be talked about. They didn't want natural flood control to be talked about. They didn't want to talk about the wetlands that would be lost when they extended the the airport runway that the EIS was calling for. Now, I mentioned the EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement. It governs the project. It's 1,300 pages, and it's supposed to list and describe all of the environmental impacts out here. And I've read it twice. It's inadequate at best. It's really an embarrassment. It does nothing to capture the value of this most critical area. The 5.5 mile area that is selected from I-10 extending along the thruway for the most part, all the way to Kali Saloon, or a little bit past the airport, so almost Kali Saloon. It could not be more critical to water resource management and the health and the natural environment of Lafayette. Again, just below the surface, extending immediately adjacent to the Vermilion River, the Chico Aquifer, the recharge area, the Cypress Island Swamp, and the other wetlands contiguous to the airport land, all of which converges to form our watershed. Also in the area is the LUS Water Works, the contaminated rail yard, which is an area posted under the Wellhead Protection Program, and the designated sole source aquifer. It's all connected. The EIS did talk about the contamination, and they talked about utilizing best practices, best design features. They recognized the threat to the Chico Aquifer, but they said they would do everything they could to try to not damage the Chico Aquifer. But now we know it's no longer a threat, it's a fact. They've sat on the contamination for 2 decades, done nothing, and now it's in the aquifer. And they did this for what? An elevated highway? Why have we been saving it? Why didn't we clean it up 20 years ago? You can't leave this stuff sitting, especially when your water wells are there and the aquifer is just 38 feet below. And we have many other sites like that throughout Lafayette Parish. What are we doing with them? I have asked some folks about it. Well, we rely on our private sector to bring that to our attention. We really have to get together as a community and demand more and expect more. Let's see. Yeah, just a little bit more. Let's see. The environmentalist of the community wants all citizens that want their water to be protected to please join in and help. We need a major mind shift. Everyone, talk to your neighbor, talk to your families, talk to your church, talk to your local councilman, write to your state. Submit a comment to the official Lafayette Connector website. There is a place there to submit a comment, please. We really need to affirmatively act and take all necessary and precautionary steps to protect the aquifer. So Watermark Alliance wants LCG to know there is a sector paying attention to the natural environment, and in particular this project. Watermark Alliance wants LCG to adopt a comprehensive wellhead protection program with serious restrictions aimed only to safeguard the water. Watermark Alliance wants LCG to establish and develop ordinances to flag all known contaminated sites throughout the parish. And let's look at them all together and see what can be done as a community. LCG did a fantastic job bringing in all sorts of national experts to work on the CSS process, to engage the neighborhoods in the area of influence. It was a fantastic effort. There wasn't a single expert for the environment. I don't know how many contracts were let out, the cost of those contracts, the effort that was done. And it was not all for naught, because it was really a very valuable exercise to see these communities come together and talk about what's special about their area, where they'd like to improve, and really just come together as a community. But the stakeholders and the decision makers say they want to do it right. But that's not going to happen unless you look at all of these issues, and unless you support and defer your decision on I-49 until the study, the comprehensive study that Bill's lawsuit is calling for, and the work plan that should come out of it, and let those two studies and that work plan inform your decision. I don't know how we can say right now that an elevated is the best option. It certainly isn't with pilings being driven into this site, the rail yard site. There's a 1.5 mile sector out of the 5.5 mile sector that is over this site. And it's elevated, and they want to drive pilings through it. So I guess in closing, I'd just like to say it's time for all of us, the community and the government, to get together and expect more for everyone in our community. Regroup, rethink, really. And that's it.
Thank you, Kim. My apologies for almost interrupting your presentation. Mike Walden, environmental engineer. Mike, you're on. Let's hear about DOTD Phase 1 findings concerning contaminants in the rail yard.
Now that sounds exciting, huh? Let me see if I can get my presentation going. There I am. Slideshow. There it is. All right. We did want to mention our websites, so I was asked to add that in.
Could you pull the mic a little closer to you? Mike?
Yes, actually, I'm going to move over this way a bit. As I said, my name is Michael Walden. I'm a retired lot of things. I started my career at LSU as a professor in the Institute for Environmental Studies. I worked there 10 years. I came here to UL and worked for 10 years in the USL Center for Louisiana Inland Water Studies, and that's part of the Civil Engineering Department. Then I retired from UL and went on to work as a consultant for a while in environmental areas. And then I became a hydrologist for the federal government, and I worked for the federal government in Everglades protection for 12 years. Then I got to move back to Lafayette, and I'm now happily retired with my wife and 2 kids. So I have been doing this for a very long time, and I really appreciate the government employees who are working on the different aspects of this, both the I-49 connector, protecting the aquifer, environmental protection. In my experience, many of these folks are some of the best and the brightest that you can find. And I don't want anything that I say to be taken that I'm critical of the people in the government that are working on this. Now, we do know that there are the water wells that are in the vicinity of the rail yard. This is a list of them with their addresses. It's easier to see them if you look on this map that I made with Google Earth. You can see the water wells with their numbers are listed, and they're shown as green push pins in the map. And the red zone, this red shaded area right there, that's our rail yard. And you can see that there is a cluster of our water wells that are just north of the that big 40-acre railroad site. There's also a second cluster of water wells that are really not that far away, that are over, and they kind of make a half circle around the parish's golf course there, our public golf course. So this is what we're talking about. Now, one thing that I wanted to talk about tonight is that we finally got to see the phase 1 environmental site assessment for the I-49 connector. Ever since I first got interested in this, I've been asking when I was allowed to speak to DOTD employees one-on-one. We're never allowed to speak in public, but we're allowed just one-on-one private conversations with them. I would say, where is the site assessment? You know, where is the phase 1 study? And they would always tell me one thing or another. Finally, someone did tell me that, oh yeah, I think one was completed. So Kim was good enough to get a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request into them, and actually got the site assessment report. This site assessment report is now a year old. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about site assessment reports and what the state consultants found who did this report. Now, if you've ever bought a house, you know when you buy your house, you have to get a termite inspection and a structure inspection. You know, there are things, and you have to get those because the bank says, if you don't get them, we won't loan you money for a property that hasn't been inspected that way. Even if the bank wasn't loaning you the money, it'd probably be a good idea to get those inspections. And they're well-defined inspections. If you go out and just buy some property, the bank is going to tell you, if you want us to loan you money on that property, you're going to have to get a site assessment done, a phase 1 study, because we want to see that there's no future liability, environmental liability associated with that property. These are pretty well standardized reports that are done, and consultants do them all the time. Generally, what you do in a phase 1 site assessment is you just look at records, public documents, you talk to people that are knowledgeable, you drive by the site, you probably take a few pictures and stick them in the report. You find any old maps. You look for anything you can find that tells you that there's evidence that there might be contamination here, that there might be a problem. So that's pretty much that's all a site phase 1 is. It's really getting ready to see if there's a problem. And if it's not a huge project, and you're buying some property, the bank will probably say, yeah, your phase 1 study came back, said there weren't any problems, we'll loan you the money, you know, if you're good for it. If however, there are problems that are identified, you're probably going to have to do a phase 2 study. Phase 2 study would go out and actually take samples and actually try to identify what the problems are that were seen in the phase 1 study. And sometimes even a bank will make you do a phase 3 study where now that you found out what the problems are, you've got to do a phase 3 study and report that says, here's the remediation that's got to be done, here's how much the remediation is going to cost in order to make this land not be a liability and also be appropriate for the uses that I want to make of it. Well, governments also have to do phase 1 studies, and they have to go through a process, just that same process. So our state government contracted to get a phase 1 study done. The phase 1 study, came back as over 1,000 pages long. It's really huge. This is just the cover of it on the right-hand side. The draft was completed in February 2016, but we only got it late in 2016. So it's been in the process. We were hoping to be involved with the consultants as they did the study, and to be involved and have the public be involved with the study, but we didn't even, we were not allowed any interaction with that. You're not worth that. So the study did, I think partly because they didn't come and talk to us, it did miss some information. An important piece of information is the LUS water well monitoring data. They didn't include that. They didn't include any information from that in their work. And certainly one of the first things I would have told them to do was to look at the water well data. But they did identify multiple RECs. An REC is a recognized environmental condition. That's a red flag of something you need to work on. And the study concludes that based on 24 of the RECs that show problems, because of those 24 RECs that show problems, additional study needs to be done, which basically means a phase 2 study needs to be done on all those 24 RECs that were identified. So they looked at 195 properties that the state is planning to either purchase or take by eminent domain in this area.
Water's coming.
What?
Water's coming.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm just getting over the flu. It's a little difficult. One of the 24 RECs is the former Union Pacific, Georgia Pacific Conoco site that we're talking about, that big red area that I showed in the earlier slide. And so further investigations are required, and we'll see if it turns out that oh dear. We'll see if a phase 2 study ever actually does happen from the DOTD. You would think that you would do the phase 2 study long before you got into any detailed designs, because the phase 2 information is going to give you information about really fundamentally important things that are going to possibly change the design of the project. And certainly you would think that the phase 2 study would have been done before you came up with a projection of what the cost of the project would be. But they've come up with a cost estimate for the project that just ignores the environmental costs of the 24 RECs that they identified, because they haven't done a phase 2 study to identify what they're going to do, and they haven't done a phase 3 study to identify what they need to do. All right. So there are a number of deficiencies still in that report, even though it does come up with that conclusion that it needs more work. DEQ required that they not talk to people when they did the study. So they, in a normal phase 1 study, you would go out and you would interview local people with knowledge of the area. They had a requirement in the scope of work of the contract that said that they should not talk to people. They didn't review improvements in our knowledge about the aquifer that have happened since the 1990s and even before the 1990s, that we have more scientific knowledge now about the aquifer than we did back when the EIS was completed for this project. But none of that scientific literature, theses were done. They didn't talk to any of the academic people at the University of Louisiana who actually do the research on the Chico aquifer. You know, this wasn't done. So there were definitely deficiencies in the project. One of the deficiencies I think that they had is that they didn't look at the LUS well monitoring data, because that is really just a direct measure of part of what kind of problem we have out here. Now, the little picture here is a picture of one of our water wells, and you'll see those around the area. They're not really huge, intrusive things, but they pump a lot of water. Total, we pump about 20 million gallons of water a day out of those wells. So LUS, when they do their monitoring, they monitor untreated water as it comes out of the wells. They monitor at the treatment plant and in the distribution system and at the tap. They are required by EPA every year to summarize their monitoring data and put it in a report that they put in the water bill and mail out to all of us. So once a year in your water bill, you'll get a report that looks something like this. The earliest one I've been able to find is from 2002. The most recent one I've been able to find is 2015. So thank you. Now, this is just a cutout of a small section of the 2015 drinking water quality report. And I think it's interesting here to see. Oh, yes.
Do you think it's unreasonable to say that they were deliberate and went out of their way to avoid talking to people who are knowledgeable, Sierra Club Youth, Harold, that they were deliberately going out of their way to avoid the topic of contamination? Do you think that is, I know you might not want to go that far, but do you think that's an unreasonable statement? Because that's quite an accusation. That's how I feel. I know a lot of people sitting around me who are really angry that they were deliberate and went out of their way to avoid the topic of contamination, which I think goes to the heart. And I'm asking you, do you think that's an unreasonable accusation? That the 24 RECs and their approach to the topic, that they were deliberate in their effort to avoid the topic of examining contaminants, and they didn't want that issue. Is that an unfair statement?
No, I think it's completely fair. Sean Wilson, who's the Secretary of DOTD.
I want to know, who can I accuse? Is there any?
Okay, I'm telling you.
Okay.
Sean Wilson, Secretary of DOTD, wrote a letter to the editor, following a letter that I wrote, asking that we have more public participation, and gave his reasons that he doesn't want us to be allowed to speak at the meetings. He doesn't want public participation. He said that a small number of rowdy people who oppose his project, he will not give them a platform to speak. So I think he's answered the question. No, they are trying not to give a platform for us to speak. They want to promote their project.
And not talk about contamination.
Yes. So,
Thank you.
yeah, so you can see the contaminants. This is a little bit difficult because this is from all the water wells, all those water wells you saw on the map, all the compounds of concern that are considered contaminants of concern that were detected in 2016 from the water wells, from any water well. So we don't have the individual well data, and I don't know any way to get it. But we do have this summary data, and we know that they have detected arsenic, barium, fluoride, 2-ethyl phthalate, nitrate, oxamyl, and PDB. And they suggest places where those might have come from. For example, you can see oxamyl maybe coming from our apple orchards and our potato farms, and it's probably coming from your tomato plants, you know. And arsenic is getting in there from erosion of natural deposits. PDB, what do they say? Discharge from industrial and chemical factories.
We don't have that.
Well, I made some changes to it. Here are the places I think these things are coming from.
There you go.
Arsenic, well, in 2002, they didn't have arsenic coming up as a detected material. So the idea that it's coming from some natural erosion process when it wasn't there before and suddenly we're starting to see it makes me very suspicious. Arsenic is very heavily used in rail yards. Arsenic from the late 1800s when they started doing this. You get your railroad tie and you treat it with arsenic to keep termites from eating it. You know, so creosote and arsenic, that was the big thing to treat wood. Then all along the railroads, they would spread arsenic on all on both sides of the railroads because it kills plants if you put it in a high enough concentration. Of course, it kills people too if you put it in a high enough concentration. But they couldn't go mow the grass all along all the railroads, but the engineer needs to be able to see if there's anything up on the tracks. You can't have plants coming in, growing in. So they would use arsenic as a herbicide. And then barium, I don't know what they use barium for, but if you look in other rail yard closure documents, you'll see that barium is one of the things that is in rail yards. It's a contaminant that you see when they close rail yards. Fluoride, I left that out. I don't think that's really of great concern. DEHP, that was a diethyl it's DEHP. It's seen in rail yard contamination. Now nitrate is fertilizer. And where do you have problems with high levels of fertilizer and pesticides? You have problems with fertilizer and pesticides at golf courses. And where do half of our wells form a little half circle, you remember? Right around the golf course. So the fact that we got nitrate coming in, that's pretty clear. Oxamyl, I don't think it's coming from the apple orchard. It's a pesticide made by DuPont, I believe. It came out in 1979. It was first manufactured. So wherever that's coming from, it's gotten down to the water wells in the time since 1979, probably in 1980s when we first got it. Golf courses use pesticides quite a bit. Oxymel is a nematicide, and nematodes will attack your turf grass. So oxymel probably was used in the golf course as a nematicide to kill the nematodes, and maybe as early as in the 1970s. And now we see that the evidence that there is an impermeable barrier that keeps the surface water from getting to our water wells, that's just not true. Because oxymel, that can only get there from the surface. It didn't come in from some recharge 10,000 years ago. So, and then finally there's the paradichlorobenzene. It's in its chemical form, it's a white material, smells like mothballs. Its use is as a residential and soil fumigant. It may have been used on the golf course, but now we know it's actually one of the contaminants in the rail yard. So these materials, the next time somebody with the I-49 connector, with DOTD, or with the city parish tells you we have an impermeable layer that doesn't allow chemicals to get from the surface to where the water wells are 550 feet below ground, that's just not true. It's really not a matter of law or faith. It's a myth that it can't get down there. The facts show that the materials get down to our water wells. Now, all these are currently at low enough levels that they're either below a level of health concern, or they can be removed so that they can be treated and there's not a health concern. But our aquifer is a thing that we need to leave to our children and our grandchildren, and to be here for our 10th generation out grandchildren. That aquifer can be a resource and a valuable resource forever here. If we contaminate it, it could very easily take 10,000 years for it to naturally recover. We need right now to find out what the level of contamination is, where the contaminants are in that aquifer, work to remove the contaminants that are in the aquifer if they're there, and be sure that nothing else goes into the aquifer. So that's all I had to say.
Okay, thank you, Michael. That was great. Detailed, I hope. We probably should have walked around and shaken people up to some of us keep awake through all that talk of chemicals, but it's really important, and it's really important information to stay alert on and to follow through. I know sometimes it's laborious to do that. Okay, we have Harold is going to give us a few words on the history, and then we're going to open it up to public questions and comments.
First of all, thank you all for being here. And let's give a hand to Mike and Kim and Bill for an outstanding job. I'm going to briefly go over the history of the railroad, how it got here and the history of it and so forth. I feel I'm a part of it. My dad worked for the railroad. My grandfather worked for the railroad starting in 1910 till he died in 1934. My uncle was the chief mechanic there at the roundhouse. I had two uncles that worked there. So growing up at school, going to St. Genevieve's and Cathedral, I would often visit my uncles there. So often watch what was going on and saw what was going on, and kind of crossed the railroad yard every day going to school at Cathedral. So I kind of lived it as part of my history, and it's a very important part of Lafayette. It's part of our economic success. The first train to get to Lafayette was the Sabine in 1875. And when that train was retired, it was placed at the depot in about 1920 and stayed there till 1943 when it was scrapped for war materials. It was donated to the war effort, so to speak. Lafayette was a principal point of refueling and rewatering. And I'm getting a lot of this information from Pappy Landry, who was on the city council and actually was as a guest at one of our meetings. And he was actually an engineer, and he was head of the railroad union here. So had long discussions with him about that history, as well as living part of it. The roundhouse was built in 1882, and that was an overhaul garage, so to speak, where they had 8 tracks where a train could be parked there, and rebuilt. The old steam trains didn't have common parts. So every train was individual. All the parts had to be handmade by machinists on lathes and blacksmiths and so forth. My uncle was a blacksmith, so he was the head blacksmith. So I watched that happening as they rebuilt connecting rods and big heavy parts and components that seemed awful hard to move around. And over the real hot, coal-fired blacksmith type furnaces. And so it was always interesting to watch. But as the first thing they did when they overhauled the train was, they drive it up to the actual, there's a table, a round table, so to speak, that directed the train to be repaired to one of 8 tracks. It was first sprayed down with trichloroethylene. This is a solvent used today in the manufacture of televisions and computers and so forth. It quickly evaporates. They would completely wash the train with this. And then it was steam cleaned. 7, 8 guys with big steam sprayers was spraying the train down. All of that landed on the ground. All the grease and residue and loose paint, whatever, would land on the ground. And then it was hauled into the roundhouse where it was all taken apart. Now they had sheet metal over the furnace and over the boiler. And the old train, 2/3 of the front of the train was the boiler and the furnace. And the drivers, the engineers kind of sat behind on the side. All that sheet metal came up, and all of that was covered with asbestos. And as it took it apart, it all broke apart. And that was put in little wagons and hauled to the pond immediately east of the roundhouse. Now this is a big old pond. I don't know how deep it was. It probably was 2 or 3 acres. And there was a track that kind of went across the middle of it. Everything was dumped in that pond. When transformers went out, burned up, whatever, rail cars, tank cars that had been in derailments that were all busted up were actually pushed off. They made a hell of a splash. My uncle was always saying, they're going to dump one of those things in, come see it, you know. And so everything went into that. And this thing must have been 20 feet deep, because maybe you dump a big old rail car and it would disappear. And so the times were different. Now this roundhouse operated from 1882 to 1960. It was even used when they were converting to diesels. They still use the roundhouse for some of the diesel train maintenance. That was one function. The next was refueling. There were 10 passenger trains a day, 5 from Houston going to New Orleans, and 5 from New Orleans to Houston. And they couldn't bring the filling station, they couldn't bring the train to the filling station. So the filling station had to be where the train stopped. So on one side, kind of east of the depot, is the tanks and all the pipes and plumbing to refuel and rewater these passenger trains. And then there's another same assembly right near the Jefferson Underpass. So if a train was going west, the engine stopped, it allowed the passengers to get out at the depot, but where it stopped, they rewatered and refueled. A train could run about 600 miles on the fuel, but it could only run about 300 miles on water. So water was critical. Sand also. They used sand to purge the lines going to the furnace, but most important, they had to drop sand on the rail, on the drive wheels to be able to move. And so resanding, rewatering, refueling was another principal operation. And disassembly and assembly of the whole, the freight cars and tank cars and all of them were dropped off here, picked up here, and so forth. So that was another major function of railroad. It involved, over 1,000 people. And when it closed in the 60s, they just scraped off everything on the surface, didn't deal with plumbing, didn't deal with the water wells. All that plumbing is all there. There's over 200 tanks. The Consolidated Company case talks about the dynamite that was left behind, that nobody knows where it is because nobody wanted to tell where it is. So you got 78 years of asbestos being dumped in a pond, all kinds of wrecked cars, transformers over the years, and this railroad yard used a lot of electricity. All these lathes and cutting tools and so forth were all electrically driven. And one of the benefits of the railroad was that it allowed Lafayette to build an electrical power plant in 1897, the Great Grand Street Power Plant. 105 megawatts. Now, we use 400 megawatts now with 120,000 people, so 105 megawatt hours is an awful lot of electricity for a little bitty town. The university was born about 1897, but by 1900 it had about 500 students. So we didn't use a lot of electricity, but the railroad did. And it used the exact same fuel that the trains used, number 6 bunker oil that sold for about 2 cents a gallon then. That's why they weren't worried about spilling a little bit on the surface. And so the pipes, the hoses, all the stuff, the tanks underground are all still there. And each one probably is a leaking source, just like the tanks we use at filling stations. So this should have been dealt with in 1960 when it closed. The community should have dealt with it. The railroad should have dealt with it. Because if they'd fixed it in 1960, it would cost a lot less than now. And so this way past due, it's a ticking time bomb. And we heard a lot about the water contamination underground. But there's a lot of other issues. Surface is a big issue, the surface contamination. During Festival International, during Mardi Gras, hundreds of cars parking on it. The whole place is full of cars. All the dust and everything contains lead, no telling what. Certainly trichloroethylene, all these contaminants on the surface. In an attempt to control surface runoff contamination, the rail yard put 12 by 12s all over the place as surface dams with the hopes that they would contain the water and the sunlight, like sunlight taking chlorine out of a pool, would take some of the contaminants out. So runoff from that goes into the bayou, which lands in the crawfish ponds, in the oysters, into coons, catfish, and so it comes literally right back to our table. But also you have the air emission problem. Many of these chemicals are what we call volatile organic compounds, VOC. They constantly evaporate. And so they constantly mix into air quality issues. In your Iberia, we cleaned up a 0.2 acre site. That was a fuel station, a 2-pump gas station, 0.2 of an acre. And it cost over $30 million. They took the soil down to 35 feet. And then they had to put a barrier, a liner, and then put new soil over it. And now it has air monitors continually monitoring the air over it for the possibility that the VOCs from benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, all these things that come with fuel, is constantly insulting the air in the community around your area. So this is a ticking time bomb. It's something we need to deal with and fix. The railroad is certainly an entity that can afford it. Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad had a profit, according to that 10K report, 2015, of $2.8 billion. They're part of Berkshire Hathaway, which is a conglomerate pretty much run by Warren Buffett. Their profit in 2015 was $28 billion. All over the country, they've cleaned up these sites. In Houston, in New Orleans, in Baton Rouge. Why not Lafayette? I don't know, but it's time that this court proceeds. It's in federal court, thanks to Bill, and the plaintiffs like the Salvation Army that said, we have a responsibility to the community to bring it to court and fix it in a minute. So thank you all for being here.
Okay, thank you. Time to open up to public comment and questions. So we are open for business. I have a question for Mike. I'll start off. Mike, we have been asking for, maybe I should ask for a microphone with another battery in it. This one sounds spotty. Let me use. Sounds okay? Okay, sounds okay? All right. We've been asking for a comprehensive study of the contaminants in the rail yard, and would is the phase 1 and if we got there, phase 2 sequence DOTD study adequate to meet that need, or are we looking for more of a comprehensive study of contamination in the rail yard area?
Here, give me that.
No, that's not really even the purpose of those phase studies. The phase studies are used to estimate liability, financial liability. So they are different.
So maybe Bill, if you could maybe comment on that. How do we put it in words, what we're asking for? A comprehensive study of the contamination in the rail yard sounds pretty good to me, but is there another way to put that, and how do we make that happen?
Well, that's exactly what it's called, a comprehensive evaluation. It's what the federal court judge found about 10 years ago, and which has not happened because there has been there was a settlement of that prior lawsuit. But, you know, it's environmental cleanup 101. You can't design a cleanup until you define the extent of the contamination, right? I mean, you've got to find out what the limits are. That's never been done. You can't do it by just looking at Conco or just looking at Georgia Pacific or just looking at Lot 22. You have to look at the entire area, figure out what the limits of it are. You have to fully characterize what the contaminants are, because when you've got some of these solvents like Harold was talking about that they use to clean and degrease, those things break down in the subsurface. And so you might start off with trichloroethylene, TCE, but that will break down over time into different daughter compounds. And so a case that I had involving Dow and Plaquemine, TCE was the source, But the contaminant that showed up in the water well was vinyl chloride, which is a second daughter of the TCE. So it's very complicated when you're dealing with these volatile compounds to figure out what the actual source material is. And when you're dealing with a 40, I think it's a lot more than 40 acres personally, but you know, I'm not criticizing anyone for saying 40 acres. It's been identified as that in federal court decisions, but it goes a lot farther than that. But nonetheless, you get a 40, 50, 60, whatever acre it is area, and you're talking about depths down to 40 feet. It's a very, very, very complicated problem. It takes a lot of time, and comprehensive means vertical and horizontal evaluation and a intense geochemical study as well.
Okay, Margaret's got a question right there.
In the data provided by Lafayette utility system, there was qualitative data as far, but no quantitative data as far what we have seen. Do you have, for example, quantitative data in part per billion or part per million and comparing it to what is tolerated or not tolerated?
Yes, actually, we do have some qualitative data. I strongly suspect, or I question the legitimacy of those numbers. And the only reason I do that is because I have to understand how that sample was taken. But nonetheless, the numbers are well below what are the recommended limits under the Safe Drinking Water Act and EPA. I think for DCB, I think it's 75 parts per billion, and we're getting like 3 and 5 parts per billion. But
That's at the faucet level?
well, all right, this is at some point, I've got 15,000 documents that I just got from a public record request I made 2 months ago to the city, okay? I have not had a chance to evaluate those, and they're still giving me more. But to answer your question more directly, we don't know how those samples were taken. And you know, obviously there are samples that were taken before they get into the treatment system, and there were samples that are taken after the treatment system. What happens during that treatment process, I don't know yet, so I can't answer that. But my big question right now is the stuff that at the point where it enters the plant, if they took samples there, how were those samples retrieved, and how were they preserved to make sure of the integrity of the actual laboratory analysis? When you're dealing with volatile chemicals, they evaporate. And if you don't secure that sample properly, by the time it gets to the lab and by the time it's sampled, a lot of the chemical has just evaporated off. So there's a sample bias when you're dealing with these volatiles. And there's a reference, I have seen one reference to where they took a sample, they said they took it from a spigot. I don't know what that means yet, but that sounds pretty shaky to me, that somebody's opening a faucet and putting it in some kind of container and then send it to a lab. I mean, that's not a very good indicator of what the concentrations were of that volatile organic compound when the sample was actually retrieved from the ground.
Could I say, the summary reports that are the annual summary reports do list also the average value that was seen and the total range that was seen for the concentrations. I left that off because it was just too much on the slide.
Okay, I think we have a question from Marshall Broussard.
Yes, yeah. I would like to address this man's question a little earlier. One of the things I think it's imperative we all understand that this is ongoing, that any measurement taken today, more than likely a couple of years or weeks, days, hours, minutes from now, may be a lot more serious in terms of quantitative. And that's just a comment. My question is not a question, essentially. I'd just like to call the roll. Starting last Thursday or Wednesday, I went around the town delivering invitations to different groups and people. And Tuesday night, we delivered invitations at the council meeting. So I just want to see who responded. Please respond by saying here. Joel Robidoux. Kevin Knockamp, District 1. Jay Castile, District 2. Patrick Lewis, District 3. Kenneth Boudreau, District 4. Jared Bellard, District 5. Bruce Comp, District 6. Nanette Cook, District 7. Liz Hebert, District 8. William Terrio, District 9. Louisiana DOTD, are you represented here tonight?
Mr. Lowell Duyall is here from Lafayette Consolidated.
Please raise your hand, sir.
Recognize
All right.
him. He did take the time.
Louisiana Public Health. Diocese of Lafayette. Quanticadiana. Mr. Weiss left early, okay. All right, Sierra Club.
Yay!
The only other question I have, and that granted wasn't a question, I do have a question, is I want you to ask yourselves, and you don't have to have a show of hands for this one, but just ask yourself, how many people in your lives do you know, in your family or acquaintances, have suffered diseases that can be attributable to environmental causes and are not being attributed to environmental causes because of the state we live in. If you have cancer, or like my uncle who was a railroad engineer and who died of a very mysterious, very rare blood disease, you know, it's time we start paying attention to environmental causes for the illnesses we suffer. Every year, when the ladies in pink run their 5K, I think, this is horrible. We live in a red state. We live in a cancer state. Please reflect on that in everything you do from now on in terms of our water. Thank you.
I have a question for somebody
Yeah.
up there. Is this only a North Lafayette Parish problem, or is this a problem that is parish-wide?
Okay, Harold, do you want to address that?
Well, for sure, the air freely flows throughout the parish. The water from the Vermilion goes all the way down, backwards and forwards, by the way, into St. Martin Parish. As it goes backwards, that's another big problem. And so that surface contamination is moving. And of course, our well water is being sold to Broussard, Youngsville, Carrickrow, and on, and to some of the water districts in the parish. So it probably goes out to 150,000 plus people.
So I think the answer is something like if the contamination gets into our aquifer and gets into our wells, it goes to all the people to whom Lafayette water is sold and distributed.
Can I mention this too? You know, when they talk about that chlorobenzene, that's a VOC. It's in the water at parts per billion. Well, you think that's no big deal. You drink it, so you get it through ingestion. When you shower in it, that's dermal. It's coming in through your skin. When you are showering, it readily evaporates. So you're breathing it into your lungs. And all that water from your shower is going into the sewer plants, into the bayou, into the crawfish ponds, the rice fields, into the oysters and the crabs and all the things we enjoy in our seafood platter. So the pathways are multiple. That is the real problem. Is that chemical bioaccumulative? Does it get into the oysters at a much higher level? The problem with pelicans and eagles and ospreys was that the chemical engine was in the water with parts per million, parts per billion. It ended up in mullets in their food at parts per million. So it ended up affecting the thickness of their eggs because it was bioaccumulative. Some of these chemicals are exactly the same way. They're variable levels, but they're coming at us through what we eat, what we drink, what we bathe in. So it's multiple pathways into our bodies and into our body chemistry.
Okay, other question?
This lady here has had a hand up for a while now.
Mine isn't really a question, of more a clarification. You talk in your maps, and Harold, you talked about the railroad before. The only place I know that it's big, like 8 tracks wide and a big roundhouse type of thing, is clear down by Ambassador Caffrey. Was it big here in town years ago? Okay, is this going on now, today, so that the area down there where the tracks are, I don't know how many wide by Ambassador Caffrey, is that getting the same contamination that can be causing the same problem in the future? I realize that doesn't apply to the I-49, but it applies to our water contamination.
Yes.
I would respond by saying what's there by Scott is strictly dropping off cars, adding on cars. Refueling is diesel fuel. They take on enough fuel probably in New Orleans to go across the country and back. So fueling's not a big issue. They take no water. They don't take sand. So it's an entirely different operation. And they don't, repairing now is taking an old engine out and put a new one in. And so that none of this overhaul, rebuilding, and asbestos, there's no asbestos on modern trains anymore. So a lot of the contaminant issues are totally gone from the old steam-driven operation. This was all steam trains, and they had lots of problems, starting with about 1,000 pounds of asbestos each time they took one apart. And they were taken apart 8 at a time. And, each train stayed in there about 2 or 3 weeks. So you start doing the math. You're talking about thousands of trains over 78 years that were overhauled, and all the waste products from that, the painting. When they got through overhauling the train, they brought it to the paint shed, where they sandblasted all the old lead paint off. There was no bottom to the paint shed. It was just a roof. And so all the old paint landed on the ground. And then they painted it with new paint. Most of it landed on the train, but some of it didn't. It's just spray painting. So it's continually dumping lead-based paint on the surface. And it's all still there. Nothing's going to remove it except the rain washing some of it into the body, back into our crawfish and everything else.
We've got a question here. Okay, you next, Dennis.
I think Dennis was next, yeah.
Alrighty. I've made I've submitted 2 public documents to the meetings that we've had. I've gone to many of the meetings. When I'm here tonight and I listen to what's been presented, now I'm very concerned, as all of you are. People wonder, what are we going to do? Well, it's quite simple. We're in a democracy. What you need to do is write a letter to your city council member. I recommend that you CC the Lafayette Advertiser, that's been a little bit quiet of late, and that you and anybody else you can think of, and then follow it up. Commissioner so-and-so, we read the roll. Have you had any occasion to request a comprehensive study of the environmental conditions of the area that you're considering doing putting a high-rise interstate in? I went to the meeting where where LUS presented a gentleman. He was an engineer by the name of Neef, And he talked about how they were going to do the technology. And it was basically driving, sounded like drive pipe, basically, into the earth to support this interstate. And I spent 37 years in the oil field, and I know about casing, and I know about what can and cannot happen, and it's a horrible idea, and I was very unconvinced. But the people at the meeting, it was a north side meeting at the Light Center, they bought it hook, line, and sinker, and the guy will sell it to them, and they'll all be very happy as we die.
Okay.
Hey, everybody, our time limit is right at the cutoff time here, so make your questions quick and make your answers quick.
Okay. Your comment.
This is not a question. Anthony Navarre is known to Harold and many people in this room. He's retired from the DOTD. He said in the 1960s there was a plan for the development of Central Lafayette, but the moment they found out about the toxic waste site, they scrapped it. He said this project is going nowhere. All you got to do is research the archives and find out that's true.
Okay, Ms.
This is for the lady who asked about Ambassador Caffrey. We're not talking about that area in particular. It's right here on the map. It is the old roundhouse area okay. All right, I just want to make sure, because that's all of us. I used to play there. I have the problems we're talking about.
Ms. Abraham.
Yeah, I'm Rosalind Vic Hummard's wife. I've heard the arguments that, okay, yes, we know that the water is contaminated. We know Louisiana's water is so contaminated, it is black and dark and wherever, and it's been in the news forever. Not everywhere has an aquifer. And an aquifer is from thousands of years that has been provided by nature, by God, for us, a gift, a rich gift that Louisiana has. And we're willing, I've heard the argument, well, it's all contaminated anyway. Well, why can't we just put pilings up and down the middle of town for our own benefit, for millions of thousands of dollars that's been collected in these last 20 years for what? For whom? Not for the people of Lafayette, not for our aquifer to keep it well and clean for us and for those who are coming behind us. It is unbelievable that we're willing to do this. We have to start somewhere. Yes, it's contaminated, but where do we start? We have to start somewhere, right? Where can we start? What can we do? We have to start somewhere. Please let us keep at least our aquifer clean, even if it's contaminated. What can we do to prevent it from being more contaminated so that we can live life? Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
I've been listening to all this since 2003, since they first started with I-49. I live on the north side, and I am kind of biased toward Sterling Grove. And I've been hearing all this for like 10 years, and it's like, we knew about the contamination 10 years ago. It's only gotten worse than I learned tonight. But I want to know, where is our city government in all of this? They got the report, and the city government is aware of all the contamination. But it's just like I-49, it's the same thing. They had 10 years to go ahead and to regroup and to get another plan. They come up with the same exact thing that they had 10 years ago in 2003. I think it's time that something gets done and that our city government wakes up.
Briefly, everyone, excuse me. I want to refer everyone to our Facebook page, Sierra Club's Y49, our website, LafayetteSierraClub.org. I will be posting up our petition. We have 392 signatures currently on our petition against putting the connector through the rail yard. And I would invite you to go to these sites to get a link to that petition to sign it. If you haven't already done so, thank you.
And there's a card at the back on the tables back there that has that written on it.
We have a question here.
No, we have one right here. The man's at the mic.
All right. And we also have a list in the back of contact information for your counselors, city counselors. They need to hear from us on this issue. Okay? And we have one final question there, Margaret, in the back.
We have one right here, Woody.
Okay, right over here.
And
My
then
name is
Robert.
Kevin Fitch, and this is my first Sierra Club meeting.
Woody, take Robert's too.
To me, the most important question in this whole meeting is, has the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality issued a compliance order to the railroad?
Yes.
Yes,
In 2004, both the EPA, US EPA, and DEQ demanded a cleanup of this site, and the railroad ignored both. That'll be an important subject in the trial coming up.
Take Robert's.
Okay.
I don't understand how
If I can
that
add
can
some-
happen
can-
without any ramifications, because
Can I add something?
there are criminal implications if you don't respond to a compliance order.
Absolutely. And it'll be up to the federal courts to deal with.
What was done, in my understanding with the DEQ, is that they, what we call risked the site away. They declared that the rail yard was industrial use, and so that means that it does not have to be cleaned up as much as it would if it were otherwise. In other words, you don't have to have a factory as clean as you would have a neighborhood, a residential neighborhood. That's the concept in basic terms. But when you've got contaminants in an aquifer, it no longer applies. It's no longer an industrial use. If you've got contamination in Chico, they can't waive the cleanup requirements that would otherwise be required.
I was just hoping that we could schedule another meeting so more people could attend, in particular a lot of the people involved with the design of the connector. I think it's important that we all are more aware that, you know, there's other factors that are going to come into play. So just want
Okay,
to put that out there.
We'll work on that. Are there any other questions or comments? We're running out of time here, so we need to keep it short. Marshall has one more point.
Yeah, not a question, it's not a question, I just want to inform the group that there are alternatives to action, and one of them involves an EPA, recently developed EPA thing called EJ Screen. You Google it, EJ Screen, or go to the EPA site and look for EJ Screen. You will find a software capability that is really unbelievable. What you can produce, and it's even wider, more widely acceptable now, is you can get a 3-page report that gives you a percentile comparison of whatever site you designate, whatever site you outline. You will get a report that gives you in percentile rankings where you stand. And it is really shocking to see the railroad site that I outlined and ran today, to see where we compare in terms of the rest of the world, particularly the state, the region, and the country. So this percentile ranking would be critical to anything you think is not happening. It's there, it's EPA certified, and there are additional data available with the air data, with air contamination of the air. So the various indices that are measured include parts per million, particulate matter 2.5, the index for ozone, diesel parts per million, air toxics cancer risk, respiratory hazard index, proximity and volume of traffic, lead paint indicator, index for Superfund proximity, index for hazardous waste proximity, index for water charge proximity, are all measured percentile rankings for your use. Here's the map where I outlined the railroad area, and here is the written product from that same area. So it's not only the chemicals, it's also a demographic study. So it is broken down in terms of nationality, if you like, nationality and income. and other demographic factors. This is a very powerful tool. I urge you to go to it. There's a tutorial attached. It's very easy to use, and I'll be willing to talk to anyone concerned about it if you want to stay afterwards, and I'll show you how to do it.
So to get that, you just Google EJ Screen, and you got it. All right, I think we're about ready to wind up. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Woody, could I say, Woody, I wanted to thank AOC for being here and filming this, and let people know that hopefully the meeting will be available on the cable and on the internet.
Right. It'll be on the AOC. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, John.